The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily represent those of WZML, its staff, or management.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective. To begin, here is Yanis with the local news.
Thank you, Manolis. Nancy A. Walker, the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry Secretary, announced on January 24th that the department had fined GC-WEN Management $300,000 for violations of the Pennsylvania Child Labor Act. GC-WEN Management being the corporate entity that owns 29 Wendy's franchise locations, primarily in Pennsylvania with a few in New Jersey. The department began investigating when a tip was received that children were being injured working at various Wendy's locations. Their report found 766 violations of the Pennsylvania Child Labor Act committed during 2023. The issue is not that GCW was employing children, some even younger than 16, but that they were violating the laws that regulate how much child labor can be used. According to the department press release, GCW was consistently failing to provide breaks to at least 81 of the children that they employed. This amounted to 432 violations for this one infraction alone. Further, they constantly overworked 34 of the children employed. That is to say, they had them work an excessive amount of hours. This is not to mention their habit of not securing work permits, parental authorizations, or even informing schools that they've hired or fired their students. Those infractions involved 18, 10, and 98 children respectively. From the press release, we can deduce that GCW employed at least 98 children, but we get almost no concrete information from the department itself. Important information that the public deserves to know, like how many children were employed, their age range, what injuries were the children suffering that led to the tip, and much, much more. Instead of a full detailed report, we are given a sparse 500-word press release that paints this as an open and shut case. There are no concrete steps taken or even planned to ensure that children are protected in the future. The only thing mentioned is that GCW's store managers would be, quote, required to undergo training provided by the Bureau of Labor Law Compliance on how to adhere to the Pennsylvania Child Labor Act. As if this were an issue of individual store managers not knowing the law and not an issue of a capitalist enterprise for the sake of increasing their profits, purposefully exploiting child labor in such an egregious manner that even the state government, which is in favor of child labor, felt the need to intervene. Whenever violations to child labor laws happen, the capitalist class always shifts the blame from these companies, the bourgeois state, and ultimately the capitalist system to the individual, either the individual store managers, like is the case here, or the guardians of the child. In doing so, they seek to obscure this contradiction of the capitalist system. They mask the misery that capital forces the working class and popular strata to live in. They mask how this precarity, which during times of crisis is only exacerbated, imposes a pressure on parents to leave their children at the mercy of the capitalist. There were no concrete steps presented because the state government and the capitalist state in general do not want to end child labor, but only regulate it. This is where the communists set themselves apart from the capitalists and their politicians. We understand that child labor is a scourge on the working class. It preys on their children and leaves them at the mercy of the capitalists, at the mercy of business owners and the monopolies. We uphold that children have a right to be educated and not to be exploited by capitalists for profit. Whereas we call for the eradication of child labor, the capitalists seek only to regulate it, to confine it within legal borders and thus legitimize it. The fine imposed on GC-WEN Management stands as a testament to how unserious the state is about preventing violations to their already weak laws. The department found 766 violations involving at least 98 children and determined that a fine of $300,000 was the appropriate punishment. The average Wendy's franchise store has an annual gross sales of $1,750,838. Even if we were to assume that only 20% of this figure was net profit, that would still amount to $350,167 a year, meaning that this fine represents a year of profit for one store. Given the above assumption, and that GCW owns 29 different Wendy's, this fine represents less than 1/29th or 3.45% of the company's yearly profit. This is nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Keep in mind that this is only on the assumption that 20% of gross sales is profit. Given that for company-owned stores, that number is closer to 66%, our assumption is extremely generous. Furthermore, according to Wendy's franchise disclosure document, 43.8% of Wendy's are at or above the average, meaning that it is not unlikely that at least some of GCW's stores are above the 1.75 million gross sales average. Given all of this, we cannot help but ask, what is $300,000 in the face of millions? This is why we will continue to see stories like this. It's because companies know that they are likely to get away with it. They know they can employ children, work them for hours on end with no breaks, and will likely not be caught for years, if ever. And even if they do get caught, they know they'll receive a slap on the wrist, no jail time or any real punishments, just a simple fine and maybe some retrainings for their employees. There are still those that argue that job programs or some child labor is good for children because it gives them valuable skills or opportunities. But this is just a smokescreen that the bourgeois state uses to conceal the fact that child labor is cheap labor, and cheap labor means profits for the monopolies. It is not the children of the capitalists that are forced to work, but the children of the working class. And in doing so, they are forced to jeopardize or even forego their education. Children have a right to education and to be protected, which child labor laws and the state fail to do. These laws will always fail to protect children, not only because they do not address the root cause of the problem, namely capitalist exploitation, but also because the bourgeois state is not interested in ever eradicating it. Both of these factors will ensure that these laws will never be respected by the capitalists and will ensure that this will continue to happen. So long as the bourgeoisie remains in power, and so long as the working class and popular strata continue to accept the lie that child labor is good, this same story will be repeated in news articles over and over again. It is up to the workers to stand resolutely with children and act as a shield of protection for them against attacks like this by the bourgeoisie and its state. If the state refuses to eliminate this evil, then it must be up to the workers and popular strata to do so. This struggle must be taken up by the labor movement. Every union should include the complete elimination of all child labor in their contracts as a non-negotiable item. Furthermore, any violations to such a clause should be grounds for an immediate strike. All workers can and must raise the alarm when they see these practices of child labor, even those deemed legal by the bourgeois state. I now turn it over to Manolis for national and international news.
Before we get to national and international news, I want to remind you that every day throughout this country, workers are subjected to injustices and humiliation at the hands of the capitalists, from unpaid wages to mass layoffs. We at New Worker understand the tyranny that the workplace is for workers. This is why we fight to expose these injustices. This is why we want to hear from you, the listener. Are you having issues at work? Bosses cutting your wages or hours? Are you or your fellow workers' safety being thrown out the window in the name of ever-increasing profit? You are not alone. Reach out to us to tell your story. You can anonymously send an email or even a voice memo to cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that is cwpusa@protonmail.com.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective. The Salmon River in Alaska, known to nature lovers for its crystal clear waters, is turning orange due to sulfuric acid and iron. The electrical conductivity of the water is at levels nearly identical to industrial waste. The water is, of course, no longer drinkable, and the life in it has almost entirely disappeared. This has been the case for the last 5 or 10 years, and at least 75 rivers and streams across the 621-mile Brooks Range that separates northern Alaska from its Arctic coast. The increase in average temperatures in Kobuk Valley National Park by 2.4 degrees Celsius since 2006 explains why around 40% of the previously permafrost subsoil, the layer of the soil just below the topsoil, has already melted and remained frozen throughout the year. But how can the melting of the frozen subsoil turn clear rivers orange? The answer to this question is important not only for the ecological effects of the phenomenon, but also for the inhabitants of the villages in the area, who fished and drank from the waters of the rivers. Researchers investigated changes in Alaska's rivers, exploring the role of microbes in thawed subsoil. These microbes break down organic matter, generating compounds that react with oxygen. In oxygen-deprived areas, bacteria can use other substances like phosphorus or oxidized iron. When groundwater containing these compounds meets oxygen-rich river water, it oxidizes, turning the water orange-brown due to suspended rust particles. Recent on-site studies found gray soil at 1.5 meters depth, indicative of reduced iron compounds. Thawing permafrost might trigger dormant geochemical processes that were frozen for millennia. This discovery sheds light on the changing landscapes due to thawing in previously frozen regions like Alaska. In some spots where plants seemed burned, there was orange slime on rocks and the water was super acidic with a pH of 3.5. This acidity likely comes from pyrite, a mix of iron and sulfur in the area. When sulfur mixes with water and air, it forms sulfuric acid. This acid can dissolve metals like iron, which normally turn into rust. But here, the acid stops that process, letting the iron dissolve in the water in a different form. This acidic water can dissolve other metals like copper, zinc, and lead, which are toxic. When the pyrite-rich rocks, hidden under ice for ages, meet thawing water, it creates this acidic mix. Eventually, this acid water flows into the sea, spreading the issue. Once the pyrite is used up, nature might bounce back, but for now, it's a big problem for the environment and the living things relying on it. Here, we must push back against the all-too-common rhetoric of the capitalist, which says that the people in general are to blame for climate change. Through this, they seek to lay the blame for the destruction of the environment on the working masses, on workers like you and me. But we're not the ones who own means of production. Neither you nor I made the decision to dump the toxic byproducts of, say, coal production into the rivers, sea, and air because we do not have a say in production. It was the capitalist class, and ultimately capitalism itself, which led to this. A study from the Climate Advocacy Report, Carbon Disclosure Project, known as CDP, found that just 100 companies have been responsible for 71% of global CO2 emissions since 1988. Keep in mind that these are figures that they are willing to disclose. No doubt, the reality is much more damning. We live in a society where millions of workers are brought under a single large capitalist monopoly to engage in production as part of a huge social organism. In this way, production takes on a social character. In other words, everyone is tied to it. Despite this, it is not the working masses which reap the benefits of production, but the capitalist class. All the surplus value created by the hard work of the working class is the sole property of the capitalists for who they work. In this way, the appropriation of the products of production is capitalist, is private, otherwise known as profit. This contradiction between the social character of production and the private character of appropriation is the driving force behind many phenomena, including climate change. The Democratic Party, especially its left wing, the squad of the Democratic Socialists of America, likes to posture as the defenders of the environment, promoting solutions like the so-called Green New Deal. On one hand, The Green New Deal calls for state interventions in the form of financial incentives that finance new investments in energy, transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture, while on the other, facilitating the controlled destruction of capital. Far from being measures to protect the environment or address climate change, these proposals are nothing more than state intervention to support the profitability of capital. This is a problem created by the inherent laws of capitalism, and no amount of reforms will be able to save it. The solution to climate change can only be found in socialism, communism, where production will be done according to human needs, and not in search of ever-increasing profitability. The U.S. election process is underway, with former U.S. President Donald Trump vying for the Republican nomination in the November elections. He comes out on top of his opponent, Nikki Haley, whom he had appointed U.S. ambassador to the UN. No Republican who has won both the Iowa and New Hampshire primaries has ever lost the party's anointing. At the same time, some media in the U.S. register a relatively strong current in favor of the candidacy of the so-called independent Robert F. Kennedy. What we must emphasize is that neither of these parties offer a meaningful alternative to capitalism, or even a reaction, nor do any of the so-called independent candidates. What is similar among them all, for all of them, have proven to be ultimately subservient to bourgeois interests. Workers across the U.S. are slowly but surely recognizing that no Democrat or Republican will be riding in on a white horse to save them from their suffering. They are beginning to understand that it is their class, above all, that unites them, and that the major political parties of today, even the self-styled independents and so-called leftists, offer nothing but continued wage slavery and economic exploitation. While the bourgeois parties squabble amongst themselves, the fact remains that our deplorable political and economic situation can only be solved by a communist party. Across the country, we have seen a growing militancy of labor. Workers at the Los Angeles Times went on strike on January 19th, the first in the newspaper's 142 years against planned layoffs. Dozens of workers gathered in a downtown Los Angeles park near City Hall to protest the plans. The amendments to our collective bargaining agreement, which the management is pressuring us to accept, are vulgar and intolerable, said Brian Contreras, one of the union representatives of the newspaper workers, as the employer wants to change the SSE so that it can lay off any employee he wants, regardless of years of service. 90% of the newspaper's unionized journalists participated in the strike action, including Correspondence in other U.S. cities, including the capital, Washington. The management of the newspaper announced that it will proceed with layoffs to reduce its operating costs. Although he did not announce a specific number of layoffs, American media reported about 100 journalists, or 1/5 of the editorial staff of the LA Times. The newspaper's management, owned by billionaire Patrick Soon-Shiong, had already made 70 layoffs last June. In the context of the overall restructuring in the print and online press, major newspapers are recording a decrease in their advertising revenue and their subscribers, with the employer trying to load the broken on the workers of the sector. A report by Northwestern University School of Journalism states that in 2023, more than 130 newspapers will be closed or acquired in the U.S. Now for international news. Farmers across Europe have mobilized powerfully against the crippling EU's common agricultural policy, and in France, which have been embraced by the Macron governments. These policies, by the governments, serve as a worthy defender of the interests of big farmers and other big businessmen who prey on an industry so critical to the nutrition of people. At the end of the past week, higher-level farmers' trade unions estimated that over 50,000 producers, farmers, breeders, etc., had come out in the last few days on the country's roads, complaining about the unbearable price hikes in fuel, animal feed, and other raw materials that are necessary for their crops. In addition, they recognize the noose that tightens around their necks with delays in the payment of compensations. These delays are due to disasters caused by bad weather and other natural phenomenon. At the same time, the concern of the agricultural world, especially of small and medium-sized producers, whose crops are identified with their own survival, not the expansion of investments, is also increased by agreements with the EU
while it runs with other transnational associations, bargaining the terms of trade transactions not based on how the people will have access to adequate and nutritious food, but on the basis of competitiveness of monopolistic groups, the pieces of the pie from markets outside and inside Europe, etc. French media reported that many agricultural gatherings were gathered outside stores of large food chains, also now denouncing the particularly low prices at which the respective groups want to buy the products to increase their own profit margins. However, farmers continue to mobilize in many other European countries such as Germany, Italy, Romania, and Switzerland. In Switzerland, the Union of Farmers, known as the USP, said in a statement that it wants the indignation of the farming world to be heard and that it shares the demands of farmers in other European countries. He added that the substantive problems facing neighboring countries' farms are not unknown in Switzerland. He focused, among others, on the low level of farmers' incomes, the great financial pressure, the new demands with only partial compensation of the extra costs, to conclude that only a small drop of water, like the abolition of the tax reduction on rural fuel, was enough to break the glass. The rural families of Switzerland, they understand very well the indignation of their European colleagues and share their claims. With an eye on the growing influence of Russia and China in Africa, the U.S. is stepping up moves for its own alliances, as the head of the State Department's tour of West Africa showed. In particular, Anthony Blinken was expected to complete official contacts in Ivory Coast, Cape Verde, Angola, and Nigeria, focusing on securing new investments for U.S. monopolies as well as military partnerships. Indicatively, in the meeting he had with his Angolan counterpart, Tete Antonio, Blinken discussed the U.S.-Angola bilateral relationship, arguing that the growing cooperation of the two sides in major railway infrastructure projects and the exploration of space is important. As he said, the United States has committed to financing the renovation of the existing 1,300-kilometer Lobito Atlantic Railway, and we have taken the first steps to build 800 kilometers on a new railway line that reaches Zambia, including through a joint venture with Angola and other partners. Blinken added that these projects constitute the largest U.S. investment overall in the rail network of the whole of Africa, judging that they have wider significance for the cooperation and infrastructure with global value implications in Angola. Washington, however, also favors joint progress in defense matters, with all that this entails at a time when the so-called countering terrorism and defensive security expands the concentration of more and more combat systems and military forces in the region of Africa. According to relevant reports, only in the 4-year period from 2020 to 2023, the U.S. significantly increased its military aid to Angola, providing more than $18 million. Over the next year, the goal is to expand efforts to build cybersecurity capabilities in the Angolan Navy, according to the State Department. Among other things, Blinken in Ivory Coast also announced new financing of $45 million to help the West African country and its neighbors in preventing conflicts and promoting stability in the midst of regional threats. The drums of war continue to resound throughout the Middle East with a serious escalation of the barrage of U.S. raids in Syria and Iraq. On late February 2nd into Saturday, the U.S. carried out airstrikes in Syria and Iraq against about 85 targets that Washington said were being used by Iran and linked militias, taking a new step in escalating interventions in the Middle East and dropping a new fuel to the fire of the war in the wider region. The Biden administration was quick to announce that the strikes would continue, while on Saturday also the U.S. and Britain, with the help of their allies, launched new attacks against Yemen, hitting dozens of Houthi targets. The dozens of U.S. strikes in Syria and Iraq were justified as a retaliation of the death of 3 U.S. soldiers after a drone attack on a U.S. base on the border of Jordan and Syria on January 28th. U.S. strikes have killed at least 40 people in Syria and Iraq. On Sunday, 24 hours after the U.S. attacks on Syria and Iraq, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned that more attacks will follow in the near future. No so-called right to self-defense can be invoked by those who have wreaked havoc and turned the region upside down for more than 20 years, with their wars and interventions to control the wealth-producing sources and transportation routes, to change governments that they don't like.
You've been listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML. New Worker News is the official organ of the Communist Workers Platform. If you are a worker, we would like to hear from you. You can reach us at cwpusa@protonmail.com. Or you can visit us online at newworkernews.us. The capitalist class has their legion of papers, radio stations, and so much more to justify the exploitation of the working class. Reject their narrative and support the socialist press and support New Worker. And thank you for listening to New Worker Radio on 92.9 FM WZML.